He had once stood at the very top of the mountain, the podium where the oath of a nation is whispered, not shouted. Twice, he had carried the hopes of millions into that White House, turning pages of history with hands that had once only dared to dream. But now, he was just a citizen. And yet, somehow, his silence made more noise than speeches ever could. There are moments in history when a man steps down, only to rise again in the hearts of those who remember. Barack Obama was no longer the President of the United States. He had no ballot with his name on it. No campaign bus, no Secret Service sirens, no power to veto or appoint. But when the country trembled in the shadow of what was coming, the people turned their heads, not toward the future, but toward the past. Toward him. It wasn't supposed to be his fight. Not anymore. And yet, there he was. In gymnasiums reeking of sweat and hope. On stages not built for presidents, but for preachers. With rolled-up sleeves and tired eyes. Speaking. Urging. Not for himself, but for something larger. For a country he believed was slipping from its better self. For a dream he couldn't vote for, but refused to watch die. You only get one democracy, he said, if you're lucky. That was the irony, wasn't it? The man who had once commanded the world's most powerful office, could no longer vote in the one race that might save what he built. The system had moved. The lines had changed. The rules had shifted just enough. And so, Barack Obama, the symbol, the myth, the voice, became something else entirely. A witness. A shadow on the sidelines of a game he couldn't play. But oh, how he spoke from there. This is the story of the vote that didn't belong to him. But still, echoed with his name. He walked into the gymnasium like any other man. No orchestra, no presidential fanfare, no seal of office waiting behind a velvet rope. Just a low stage made of plywood, surrounded by folding chairs and a crowd that didn't need decorations to recognize a leader. The room smelled like sweat, marker ink, and the stale breath of too many anxious mornings. But when he stepped forward, all of that disappeared, because every eye knew who he was. And somehow, even without power, every light still found him. He hadn't been president for years. The suit jacket was gone, the motorcade long returned to the garage. What remained was a rolled-up shirt, a raspy voice, and a mission that didn't need title or office to matter. He wasn't here for glory. He was here because something fragile was slipping, and the people in this room could feel it too. I know I'm not on the ballot, he said, and the crowd stirred, not with laughter but with something heavier. But make no mistake, democracy is. That line hit like thunder, not because it was perfectly written, but because of who was saying it. This wasn't politics. It was memory. The kind that reminded them what it felt like to trust a leader again. 2 years ago, in this same place, he danced in a sea of confetti. Then, he had walked off stage as the most powerful man in the world. Today, he stood there as a witness to what might come undone. He didn't promise change this time. He warned them what happens when change is neglected. When truth doesn't matter, he said slowly, when fear becomes the language of politics, when leaders serve their own mirror instead of the public, then elections are no longer debates. They're alarms. And yet, beneath that voice, there was a quieter truth he never shared with the crowd. In the very state he now lived, he couldn't vote. He had missed a registration deadline. A deadline that would decide who leads the country next. One that came and went while he was planning this tour. Not for himself, but for the democracy he could no longer cast a ballot in. Backstage, in between appearances, he scrolled through news feeds like any other citizen. The polls were tightening. The noise was growing. His calendar had one day circled in red, November 3rd. He wouldn't be casting a vote that day. He would be on the road, asking others to. A young volunteer asked for a photo. Her hands shook as she whispered, "You're the reason I'm voting." He smiled. But he didn't say what echoed in his mind. "I can't." He had once held the nuclear codes. Now, he held nothing but a clipboard and a warning. They asked him outside if he missed being president. He smiled, but didn't answer. That wasn't the question that mattered. The real question was this: what does a leader become when the people need him again, but the system no longer calls his name? The cameras were aimed elsewhere now. They followed a new face, a man whose voice was louder, whose gestures were sharper, whose promises came wrapped in anger and applause. The news cycles fed on conflict. The headlines grew shorter, meaner. And somewhere between the chants and the chaos, something quiet began to happen. People started looking back. They remembered calm. They remembered complete sentences. They remembered dignity. And not because it was perfect, because it was trying. So in cities and towns where the air felt heavier and the laughter sounded more nervous, they whispered one name like a compass: Obama. He hadn't spoken publicly in months. The tradition was clear: former presidents stayed silent. But this silence, this deliberate absence, was beginning to feel like surrender. And so he wrote a speech. Not for a network, not for a campaign, not even for a crowd. Just words. Plain and urgent. The speech leaked. Within hours, it was everywhere. They read his lines like scripture: this moment is not about the man in office. It's about the office itself. And whether we still believe enough in our democracy to defend it. That sentence alone lit something on fire. Requests poured in. Come speak in Atlanta. Come stand with us in Michigan. Come remind us what this country used to sound like. And he did. Not with fireworks or slogans, but with silence turned into steel. He began showing up, in union halls, on college quads, in neighborhoods where the lights flickered at night. No entourage, no spotlight. Just a stool, a mic, and a former president speaking like a father who's seen his children drift too far from home. His voice was slower now. More worn. Not from age, but from what it carried. There's a difference, he told one crowd in Detroit, between disruption and destruction. Don't confuse the two. One tries to open a door. The other burns the house down. People cried, not because of the words, but because of the timing. He wasn't supposed to be here. He had no obligation to return. But there he stood. Not running for anything. Just refusing to run away. Backstage, aides worried. You're becoming the story, one warned. He shook his head. I'm becoming the mirror. In another town, someone asked him if this was about legacy. He smiled faintly. Legacy, he repeated. No. Legacy is what they write after you're gone. This is about what's still breathing. He was followed now, not by motorcades, but by shadows. Protesters waited outside his events, chanting old conspiracies, holding up twisted signs. The Secret Service frowned. The country had changed. So had the danger. But he never flinched. He walked through parking lots with no barrier between him and the bitter cold. He stayed late, shook hands, held babies, listened to people's fear as if it was his own. He listened because he remembered. Not the power, not the title, but the weight. The responsibility of having once held the trust of millions. And the even greater weight of watching that trust evaporate under someone else's hand. He wasn't trying to undo the past. He was trying to protect the future from forgetting it. And somewhere, deep down, he knew, this wasn't just a campaign season. It was a reckoning. He was no longer the voice of America. But maybe, just maybe, he could still be its conscience. It was election day. The streets buzzed with a strange mix of panic and hope. Families lined up before sunrise. College students clutched coffee cups and voter IDs with trembling fingers. Grandmothers in folding chairs waited 5 hours just to have their names checked off a list. The air was sharp, the tension sharper. Everyone knew, something enormous was about to tip. And yet, somewhere in Washington, a man watched it all from a distance, from behind a window that once overlooked history being made in his name. He sat in silence that morning, suit pressed, tie undone, no cameras, no press. Just a piece of mail in his hand, a sample ballot. Useless now. The deadline had passed. The system had closed its doors on a man who once stood as its guardian. He smiled. Not bitterly. But like someone watching a child go off alone for the first time. You want to be there. You want to hold their hand. But some journeys can't be shared. Some votes you must trust others to cast for you. He turned on the television and watched the lines form. The states turn blue. Then red. Then blur into gray. Elsewhere, his voice echoed. Not live, but in ads paid for by others. Not as a candidate, but as a conscience. A montage of his speeches played between commercial breaks. Don't boo, vote. You are the change. This is your moment. In Philadelphia, a teenager recorded herself voting for the first time while Obama's 2008 rally speech played from a Bluetooth speaker. In Georgia, a woman brought her son into the booth and whispered, "This is for him. But also for the man who made me believe we mattered." In Nevada, a retired mechanic with a faded Obama bumper sticker voted against everything that threatened to erase the last 8 years. In Michigan, a teacher cried quietly as she submitted her ballot. Not because she believed the country would change overnight. But because she believed it still could. And in all these moments, he was there. Not physically. Not legally. But spiritually. Politically. Historically. Because this wasn't about whether he could vote. It was about whether he still mattered. And he did. The night dragged on. Electoral maps pulsed like a heartbeat. News anchors ran out of adjectives. Crowds screamed. Some in joy. Others in disbelief. But in a small study room in D.C., Obama simply stood, turned off the television, and exhaled. He had done all he could. Without a title. Without a ballot. Without a podium. Just his voice. He walked outside into the night. The air was cool, the streets quiet. A couple recognized him from afar. They didn't wave. They didn't want to interrupt. But he saw them. And he smiled again. Because this was what democracy looked like now, not perfect, not painless, not his. But alive. The vote wasn't his. But the future still listened to his voice. And sometimes, that was enough. He didn't turn on the television that night. Not when the polls closed. Not when the projections began rolling in like incoming weather reports. Not even when the network started splashing red and blue across maps of a country he once led. The remote control sat untouched on the edge of the table. He had made a decision hours before the first ballot was scanned. He wouldn't watch it happen. Because he already had. Too many times. The room was dim. One floor lamp hummed in the corner. The rest of the house was silent, save for the occasional creak of old wood or the far-off wail of a siren in the city below. He stood near the window, jacket still on, hands in his pockets, as if waiting for someone to arrive who never would. There was no staff, no cameras, no aides rushing in with whispered updates. Just Barack Obama and the ticking of a nearby clock. He had lived through this cycle 8 years earlier, twice. The thrill of the win, the weight of the loss. He remembered how the walls of the West Wing felt the night he won re-election. The champagne, the cautious laughter, the photos taken too quickly and remembered too vaguely. But this time, the victory wouldn't be his to claim. Nor the loss to mourn. He was neither candidate nor campaigner. Just an observer. And yet, this was the most personal election of his life. He paced slowly across the hardwood floor, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the silence. In one hand he held a folded piece of paper, the remarks he would never give. A speech he wrote alone the night before, just in case. It wasn't a concession or a celebration. It was a reminder. A benediction for a country he still believed in, even as it slipped from familiar hands. He sat on the edge of the couch and stared straight ahead at the blank television screen. His reflection stared back. Older now. Grayer. Not just in hair, but in tone. The idealism still burned somewhere deep, but it flickered like a candle nearing the end of its wax. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and exhaled as if trying to release every fear he couldn't say aloud. What if they didn't listen? What if the crowds, the rallies, the speeches, what if they weren't enough? What if his voice had become an echo, bouncing off walls that no longer stood? There was no room left for doubt, but it pressed in anyway. He thought about the girl in Ohio who cried after his speech, telling him she registered because of him. He thought about the factory worker in Pennsylvania who held his hand too long, whispering, "Don't let them take it back." And he thought about Michelle, watching the returns alone in another room, because they both knew they couldn't bear to witness it together. Outside, the wind picked up. Leaves scraped across the sidewalk like forgotten ballots. He stood again and walked to the window. Across the street, lights glowed in other homes. Flashes of red and blue through curtains, flickers of television screens bouncing off tired faces. Somewhere, a cheer erupted. Somewhere else, a scream. He didn't flinch. Instead, he closed his eyes. He had done everything he could. He spoke where others stayed silent. He stepped forward when the role demanded he stay back. He risked the legacy he spent 8 years building to defend something larger than himself, the belief that this democracy, fragile and flawed, was still worth the fight. And now it was out of his hands. He turned away from the window and walked toward the back of the room. On the wall hung a photograph, his first inauguration day. The crowd, the Capitol, the oath. His hand raised, his eyes steady. He stared at it for a long time. Not out of nostalgia. But to remind himself of the promise made, and the price paid. He thought about what he would tell his daughters tomorrow. About hope, about grace, about standing tall even when the ground shifts beneath you. He thought about what America would wake up to. And then, he finally let the paper fall from his hand. It floated to the floor in silence. Words never spoken. A message never delivered. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing a leader can do, is let the people speak without interruption. He turned out the lamp. Stepped into the darkness. And trusted the rest, to them.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that move the world. Thanks for watching.